And as I said in Kyiv 3 weeks ago, this supplemental funding will ensure Putin faces some nasty surprises on the battlefield.
And that, by the way, was Victoria Nuland, a woman who is adding fuel to the fire. And by fire, I mean hate towards Russians. Hello and welcome to today's video. Today, I'm going to be talking about why Americans hate Russians. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that I hate Russians. I mean that we've been trained, we've been designed to hate the Russian people, hate what Russia is, the country. And nothing that I say now is going to actually apply to me. Obviously, it doesn't apply to everyone in the world, like as far as every American. But I want to give you the history of the hate between America towards Russia. Where did this hate come from? Well, we have to go back to a point where Russia wasn't even Russia. It was the Soviet Union. After the defeat of the Nazis in the Second World War, in 1947, the Eastern Bloc was formed, and in 1949, NATO was formed. These two powers would later go on to fight the Cold War, where we know they had no direct wars. They had proxy wars, but we'll talk about that later. Now let's talk about the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's get to the point where Russians become Russians and where Americans start to hate them now. The year is 1989. And the Berlin Wall is coming down. Now, this is not the end of the Soviet Union because there's other countries that are still forming it. But this would definitely be one of the stones that would come under the Soviet Union so that it would finally collapse and so that Russia would finally become the Russia that we know today. The Cold War had been going on for about 45 years. But one Christmas day in 1991, the Soviet flag started to lower over the Kremlin. And then the tricolors, the white, blue, and red, would rise. And so Russia, a new age would begin. The Soviet flag would be lowered at 7:32 p.m. and the Russian flag would be raised at 8 at night, Christmas 1991. And I have to say, from that day forward, the Americans had no reason why to hate the Russians. These were a new people. This was a new country. There was a new spirit of unity because the Russian people actually embraced American culture very well. They had Coca-Cola, they had all of the fast foods coming in, you know. They were open even during Soviet times, but now that they were Russia, they would soak in Hollywood, they would soak in music. American culture was very well received amongst the Russian people. But that is obviously not what happened because although Russia moved on and had a clean slate, the Americans, you know, they moved on and they started making movies. They started making just shows hating Russians. And I'm going to give you some examples right now of that. Like I said, the Americans had been hating on the Soviet Union. That is prior to Russia's existence, with movies like Red Dawn in 1984, where a supposed invasion of the Americans would come via, I don't know, airdrop somewhere on the American continent. And that is just ridiculous. And so there's also other movies like Rambo, where Rambo is captured or something like this by the Soviets. And this movie was in somewhere in the 80s as well. Now, let me tell you something. Obviously, as soon as the Soviet Union collapses, you would think that the Russian is no longer the enemy. But guess what? In popular movies in modern age, like John Wick, the Russian guys are always the bad guys. And, you know, there's countless other movies where it's just the Russian guy who's just the bad guy. And this is the most common theme in Hollywood cinema. I think the bad guys always have that thick Russian accent. And I want to do like an honorable mention to Sylvester Stallone because in many of his movies, he's actually fighting Russians for some reason. You know, like in Rocky, it's the Soviet guy. The Soviet guy. When I'm talking about Soviets and Russians, you know, even I'm guilty of mixing them because guess what? Actually, when you're in Russia, there's still people who are Soviet, who are alive, right? Even my fiance Ksenia is obviously born in the USSR. She has a Soviet birth certificate. But anyways, these are two separate countries. These are different people now mentally, and we shouldn't hate on them. What's very strange to me is that even little kids were taught that the Russians or the Soviets were the bad guys. For example, on the show The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, the two bad guys, which is a woman and a guy, they're both Russian, and they have that Russian accent. Here's a clip of that show. Now, what I found interesting was that one of the guys, his name is Boris Badenov, which is like a little joke. Check it out.
Anxious viewers, those two wrongs, Boris and Natasha, were proving they couldn't make a right. A right bad idea.
Think, darling, think. There must be something really rotten we can do today.
I'm thinking, but the worst I come up with is helping to make Moose and Squirtle show 1 hour longer.
By the way, my friends, if you don't know, let's play a game. Which one of these flags is the Russian flag? Let me know down below. Let's see if you guys know what the Russian flag looks like, because it seems like the American people, for the most part, still think that Russia's communist. A lot of the older Cold War era people believe that probably they still have the Soviet Union flag as their country's flag. So let me know which of those flags was the modern day Russian flag. As I mentioned before, the Cold War lasted around 45 years. And I also mentioned that there was proxy wars. Now, the Korean War lasted about 3 years, and it was a bloody war for the United States. A lot of veterans came back, wondering what that war was about. Why are they fighting overseas? Well, that's how proxy wars work. The Americans then had to fight in 1955 to 1975 in the Vietnam War. It is known as one of the most horrific wars that the United States had because of its ugly guerrilla warfare. A lot of veterans came back to hate amongst the civilian people. Again, another very unpopular war, perhaps the most unpopular war. And in between the Vietnam War in 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Cuba, the United States, and the Soviet Union were involved in this possible nuclear disaster. Thankful for us, we got that sorted out, but it could have ended the world then and there. Those were the two wars and the missile crisis that America went through. Now, I want to talk about the Soviet Union. What proxy war did they have? Well, from 1979 to 1989, the Soviet Union was in a place that I know very well. They had the Afghanistan War. And let me tell you, it was from experience, I know it's a horrible place. I want to play a little clip of one of my favorite songs from that war. And so, these 3 wars later, and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and finally the collapse of the Soviet Union, led to what we have now. A large proportion, like 3 generations in the United States growing up thinking that the Soviets are going to invade the United States, thinking that the Soviets are just communists, that they still exist and stuff like this. This is where we are today. We have a whole country who's ignorant on the culture of the other side, while the Russians are very well educated on what American culture is like. Unfortunately, like I said, many people don't even know what the Russian flag looks like in the United States. I truly wonder how and why these movies where Russians are the bad guys are still being made if the Soviet Union fell, and we shouldn't be hating these people anymore. What's more interesting to me is that we're going back to the old ways of proxy wars. Now, you know that Russia is in a major conflict with Ukraine right now. This seems like one of those proxy wars that America went through back in the old days. Now it seems like Russia is going through a modern day proxy war. And so this video is just being made so that you don't fall into the brainwashing that your parents and grandparents fell into during the Cold War. Because guess what? Those Russian people, they're not thinking about you every day. They're not thinking about invading your country. They're not thinking about your downfall. You know, I lived amongst the Rus, and I think they're too busy being happy the little they can whenever the snow is not in their everyday life. They're too busy fighting with winter and bears to be worried about the United States. Trust me, the Russian people embrace the American culture. They take it much easier than an American would take the Russian culture. I think that the American people, to summarize it, hate Russians out of ignorance. And thank you so much for watching this video. I hope that you learned something, and please do share if you enjoyed it and you want to show somebody a little bit of knowledge today. I'll see you on the next one.